Video, we're going to begin the study of Aristotle's categories. The categories are the first of a series of books that Aristotle wrote on the art of reasoning. So this formally begins our study of classical reasoning. Throughout history, the categories were famously difficult, and we find that wise men like St. Augustine actually boasted, as proof of their intellectual gifts and powers, that they were able to study and learn Aristotle's categories and his art of reasoning in general without a tutor. So this was really the test of gifted intellectual students, whether or not they could progress in Aristotle's art of reasoning, beginning with the categories. Now, one of the reasons why Aristotle's writings are difficult is because Aristotle intended them to be so. Aristotle lived in a time that was much wiser than our time. In our time, everything is published for the masses because people are trying to make money. Schools are eager for tuition, publishers are eager for sales, and no one really cares much about the arts themselves. The arts are not considered to be sacred, they're not protected and kept separate from the vulgar, as it were. Everything is just for sale, everything is dumbed down, everything is oversimplified. And that's a fault of modern society, where everything is done for the sake of money. In Aristotle's time, philosophers were men who chose to live in simplicity for the sake of wisdom, and they greatly respected the arts and sciences, so much so that they intentionally kept them secret. In fact, if we look at the Pythagoreans, for example, the only way that you could even have access to the teachings of Pythagoras and the other teachers of that school of philosophy was to join the school and be initiated step by step into what was called basically a mystery religion, where things were kept secret and revealed only to people who had proven themselves to be true and faithful members of the society. Aristotle was a little more public than that in the sense that he ran a school, and one of his most famous students, whom he tutored privately, was Alexander the Great. There was a point in time when Aristotle began to publish his teachings, and Alexander was at the height of his military and political activity at that time, and he wrote in frustration to Aristotle, arguing that he should not publish his instruction, but keep it private as it was. And Aristotle responded to Alexander and told him that he had published it, but he had also not published it. And what that meant was that Aristotle had made his teachings available in a way where those who were sincere, committed, wisdom seekers, true philosophers, students who wanted to be true philosophers, true wise men, they could obtain the knowledge of Aristotle's teaching from his writings by very diligent study, meditation, memorization, revision, and so on. True study, studying for mastery, as I explained throughout the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. But for the pretenders, the fakers, who are just seeking an appearance of learning for the sake of something else, something inferior to wisdom, the writings were left so unclear that they would not be able to make progress. And so the writings of Aristotle, the teachings of Aristotle, are published, but they're not published. They really are shrouded in an ancient kind of mystery that was common among the philosophers and schools of philosophy. So we shouldn't be surprised when we take up the study of Aristotle's reasonings or of reasoning or any of his philosophical works to find them difficult. That's not accidental. That's intentional. And the only way for us to progress in these studies is to commit to the pursuit of wisdom in sincerity and be willing to do the work that's necessary to master these lessons. So we'll find that these chapters in Aristotle's categories are very short. Most of them are short, some almost a paragraph. And yet there is an incredible amount of information packed into these short lessons, where the use of an individual word by Aristotle could take up pages and pages of explanation. And so these lessons are very difficult. Now, as for how you should study Aristotle, what I've always taught my students is that Aristotle, as you begin to read, you'll find that he refers to books that it wouldn't make sense for a student to have already read. He'll refer to books in advanced subjects while he's teaching simpler subjects. And some conclude then that maybe Aristotle wasn't actually the author, since this was actually published before this, and so on, but that's false. What Aristotle has intentionally done is written his works in a way that the only way that you can learn one is to learn the rest. And if you either study everything or nothing in Aristotle. So the way to study Aristotle is to first commit to reading all of his works. We have to make a simple reading of all of his works, because the only way to understand Aristotle is by Aristotle. We'll find that, for example, when we get started here in the categories, chapter 2 will be impossible to understand unless you've read chapter 5. And it's just not written like a modern book for sale. It's not written like a mass paperback or a textbook intended for a dumbed-down modern school. So the first thing that you're going to have to do is commit to simply reading through all of Aristotle's works, and then rereading them, and rereading them, and rereading them, and allowing the later works to comment and explain the earlier works, and then the earlier works to build up and help you understand the more advanced works. So it's a mysterious collection of writings. There's a reason why the writings of Aristotle have been disliked through history, why they're not popular, why they're not in modern schools, why other homeschool publishers don't even attempt to touch them, because you can't fake it in Aristotle. You can't fake it. Now, the greatest help that we have in studying Aristotle as Catholics, and a proof for us of how important and helpful they are for Catholics, is that we have commentaries written by St. Thomas Aquinas on the works of Aristotle, on some of his works in reasoning, on some of his philosophical works, lecture by lecture, detailed commentary, teaching and explaining the philosophy of Aristotle within the context of the Catholic faith. St. Thomas Aquinas refers to Aristotle simply as the philosopher. There's Aristotle and everyone else. And as Catholics, it's important for us to understand that the philosophy of Aristotle was embraced and approved by the Catholic Church after St. Thomas Aquinas was able to go through and remove the false interpretation and teaching of the Arabian philosophers and establish a true and Catholic interpretation of the writings of Aristotle. This combination of Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic theology is known as scholastic philosophy. Scholastic philosophy or scholasticism. All right? So, in pursuing the knowledge of Aristotle, as Catholics, we're joining St. Thomas and the other scholastics who have sought to understand true philosophy within the context of true Catholic theology. Philosophy being the investigation of the world, of God and the world, through human reason and observation, and theology being the study of God and the world through divine revelation, which is received by faith for God's sake. So that's the challenge we have in front of us as we study Aristotle. The purpose of my videos is going to be to help you with this first reading. I'm not going to make it simple. I'm not going to make it so that fakers can pretend to study Aristotle without giving the necessary effort that they're responsible to give. But I'll clarify some points to try and make the reading easier for you and to help you to study more efficiently. So having said all that, let's get started in chapter 1 of Aristotle's categories. Aristotle chapter 1. Things are said to be homonymous. Homonymous. Things are said to be homonymous, of which the name alone is common, but the definition of essence, according to the name, is different. Things are said to be homonymous, of which the name alone is common, but the definition of essence, according to the name, is different. Thus, man and a picture of a man are each of them said to be an animal. But the term animal, and this is my commentary, the term animal is an example of a homonymous term. Because when we say man is an animal, we mean animal in a certain sense. And when we say that the picture of a man is an animal, we use the term animal in a different sense. And let me provide a little clarification. This doesn't make much sense in English. And remember, we're simply reading a translation for the sake of convenience. In the Greek text, it's not a little clearer, it's much clearer. The word animal in Greek is zoon. It's where we get the word zoology, or the zoo, where animals are kept. In Greek, zoon is the noun that means animal. And yet that noun has a number of different meanings. We can use it to name an actual animal. So for example, man is an animal. As we'll see in a little bit in this chapter, a horse or a cow is an animal in the same sense. Okay? But the word zoon in Greek was also used to refer to a picture. Okay? A picture was called a zoon. And therefore what Aristotle is telling us is that the word zoon is a homonymous term when it's used in two different senses. To point to a man and say he is an animal, zoon, is one sense. And then to point to a picture of a man and say, look, this is a zoon, not referring to the man at all, but actually to the picture. The word zoon is used in two different senses, and therefore is a homonymous term. The picture and the man are given the same name, but that name has two different definitions. Okay? Animal or zoon in that sense, in that situation, is being used homonymously. And the reason why Aristotle's teaching us this is because this ambiguity of words, the confusion caused by the use of words in different senses, is the beginning of the study of the art of reasoning. The very first issue to be addressed before we get into arguments or fallacies or anything else that modern classes pretend to start with in reasoning is we have to deal with the reality that words are very confusing because they're used in different senses. If you get a dictionary, look up any word, there are 3, 4, 5, 10 different meanings for that word. And so the very first lesson in reasoning from Aristotle is that we can never assume that two words used in two different places, or the same word used in two different places, is used in the same way. And if it's not used in the same way, we can't use it in arguing and reasoning. We can only reason and argue using terms that have the same name and the same meaning. So we have to watch out for homonymous terms. And he gives us one example. In the English translation is animal, which is not very clear because it's not really true. But in the Greek, zoon, which is the actual example, zoon is the name of a man. What a man is an animal, but it's also the name of a picture of a man, zoon. That's an example of homonymous terms, all right? He goes on and says, thus man and the picture of a man are each of them said to be an animal, zoon. For of these, the name alone is common or shared. But the reason of essence according to the name, that is the definition, is different. Thus, if anyone explains in what the being an animal is in each, or what the being an animal in each of these consists, if we were to ask in what way is the man an animal and in what way is the picture an animal, he will assign the peculiar definition of each, the different definition of each. So if we say a man is an animal and the picture is an animal, remembering the Greek word, right? We're to ask the question, in what way is this an animal, and in what way is this an animal? And if the answer to that question is not the same, then they're homonymous terms, okay? They're same names, different meanings, different definitions, different senses, okay? Next, those things are said to be synonymous. Those things are said to be synonymous, of which the name is common and the reason of the essence according to the name is the same. So, the second group of terms are synonymous terms. First we had homonymous terms, now we have synonymous terms. Synonymous terms are words or terms where the name and the meaning are the same. The name and the meaning are the same. Now, in reasoning, this is what we need to make sure we're always using. Anytime that someone uses a term and then compares that to something else or uses that to draw a conclusion, we have to make sure that everywhere that term is used, not only the same word is used, but the same meaning, the same sense is being used. When we are sure that the same name and meaning are being used, then we have synonymous terms. Okay? Let's go back to Aristotle. Those things are said to be synonymous, of which the name is common, and the reason of essence according to the name. And he gives us an example, which I've already mentioned. Man is said to be an animal and also an ox is said to be an animal. When we refer to man as an animal and ox as an animal, we're using animal in the same sense. So if someone were to ask us, in what way is man an animal? And in what way is an ox an animal? The answer to that question would be the same in both cases, because the term animal is being used synonymously. Okay? Each of these is called by the common name, animal, and the reason of essence, or the definition and description, is the same in each case. Thus, if anyone gives the reason of each and explains in what the being an animal in each of these consists, he will assign the same reason. Okay? That's the second class of terms that Aristotle covers in this first chapter. Next, we find the third and final class of terms. Those things are called Paronymous. Paronymous. Those things are called Paronymous, which have their appellation, according to name, from something, yet so as to differ in case. And to understand paronymous terms, very simply, they're derivatives. Okay, derivatives. And we'll look at a few examples. Derivatives can be misleading because they may refer to the same thing, but in different cases, or they're different parts of speech. The words have different functions, different senses, and yet they're similar. They're not exactly the same. The names are not exactly the same as we have with homonymous terms. The names are not the same, but the definitions and meanings are similar. And so this is another source of confusion in terms. So we've learned about three kinds of terms, three uses of words. Homonymous, where the names or the words are the same but the meanings are different. Synonymous, where the words are the same and the meanings are the same. And then paronymous terms, where the names are similar because one word is actually derived from the other, and the meanings also may be similar, but they're not the same. So these are the three kinds of terms. As we begin the study of reasoning, before we even get to an argument or talk about a fallacy or any other subject in the art of reasoning, the very first lesson that Aristotle begins with is the need for the removal of all ambiguity of words and language. We have to take time to define terms, to test the meaning of terms, before we even begin putting propositions and arguments together as we're going to study through the rest of classical reasoning. The very first lesson in Aristotle's work on reasoning, the very first lesson is that we must remove all ambiguity of words and language used. This first chapter in the categories is basically directing us to go study grammar. So if you want to know where do we learn about the art of grammar and the importance of the art of grammar, or how grammar should be studied, or what the goal of grammar should be, this is our answer. The goal of the study of grammar is not merely to communicate clearly, which is of course important. Not only to communicate clearly, but to understand the subtlety of language, of different words, of the different parts of speech, of words derived from other words but used in different ways, and so on. The subtlety of speech, the subtlety of language is the first lesson in reasoning. And therefore, we could say that this first chapter of Aristotle's Categories is a call to go study grammar. Okay? And this is why in the classical trivium we have grammar and then reasoning. First, we have to study the art of grammar. And all of these things we learn in grammar. So to finish up with this reading of this first chapter, Aristotle says, those things are called Paronymous, which have their appellation according to name. And appellation really just means the name. From something, that they're derived from some term, yet so as to differ in case. Differ in case. And let me just comment on that a bit. In grammar studies, if you're studying classical grammar as you should, a modern grammar course is really designed just for modern public schools and is not suited for the study of philosophy or true Catholic education. If you study classical grammar, you'll learn about declensions, different cases, and so on. And just to understand what a case or a declension is, the word declension means a declining away from something, a difference from something else. And the question is, well, what is it that we're declining away from? The nominative case, what we call the nominative case, is actually not a case. The nominative is actually the true word, the true name of a thing. So if I point to something and say, what is that? And you answer the question with a name, you answer with the nominative case. And again, it's actually not a case, it's the name itself. All right? So when you look up a noun in a dictionary, what you're looking up is the noun itself, the name, in its regular or normal form. Or we can say case, but I want you to make sure you understand that case has a different idea. All right? Now, once we know the name itself, the nominative form, we know the name, then we begin to communicate using that name. And we find that we need to express different ideas and relationships between one noun and another noun. And the way that we do that is by changing the form of the noun to show its relationship to other words or nouns in the sentence. Okay? And there are 5 or 6, depending on what language we study, there are 5 or 6 different cases to be learned. The idea of possession, if we want to say that this is the word of God, the expression of in English, the preposition of, which expresses possession or the source, uses a genitive case. And so we change the form of the noun to show that it's expressing possession. When the case changes, the genitive form of the word and the nominative form of the word, Aristotle warns us, are now paronymous terms. They're not synonymous anymore. Okay? And we need to be careful because in reasoning, they're not the same word anymore. Okay? If we wanted to say that something is given to, or some action is passed on to something else indirectly, like I read the word of God to my children. The noun for children will be set into a different case to show that they are the indirect object of an action, and that's the dative case. Again, the case can no longer be considered to be the same as the original noun. They're paronymous terms. The direct object is represented by the accusative case, and then in Latin, the ablative case represents the source or origin of something. The vocative case is used when speaking directly to someone or something. So in Latin we have 6 cases, in Greek there are only 5 cases, but what Aristotle's teaching us here is cases are not to be confused with the noun itself. They're paronymous terms. Likewise, if a noun is derived to create a verb, or if the noun is used to form an adverb or an adjective, the verb or adjective or adverb derived from the noun is not to be confused with the noun itself in reasoning. One is derived from the other, they're related, they're similar, but they are not the same term. And that difference needs to be recognized so we don't allow those terms to enter into reasonable arguments as a source of confusion or ambiguity. Okay? Those things are called paronymous, which have their appellation according to the name from something, yet so as to differ in case. Thus, a grammarian is denominated or derived from the noun grammar, and a valiant man, or it would be better even if we said valorous. The word valorous or valiant, the adjective, is derived from the noun valor. All right? Those are paronymous terms. Grammar is the noun. Grammarian refers to a person, and being grammatical is a quality of that person. So grammar and grammarian are not referring to the same thing. And that difference needs to be recognized if anyone attempts to form an argument using those two terms as if they're synonymous. They're not synonymous. They're paronymous. Okay? The same thing with valorous or valiant and valor. They're similar, but they're not the same. They're paronymous, not synonymous. Okay? That's all that's contained in chapter 1 of the categories. Now, again, I want to emphasize, you can't fake the art of reasoning. If you look at what's available in modern circles, first of all, reasoning is not even taught in modern schools. Not even part of the curriculum in modern schools. Because the modern schools are not concerned with leading students to a certain truth or persuading them that something is true. It's this modern democratic education that really doesn't have much purpose at all. When we step away from that modern materialistic public school education, which is common even in Christian schools, when we step away from that and find a school or a publisher that's seeking to do more, we'll often find that they have courses in logic, what they call logic or reasoning, and yet we will not find them starting with homonymous, synonymous, paronymous terms. We will not find them emphasizing first the importance of mastering the art of grammar, but they will rush into an oversimplified and dumbed down idea of reasoning that's actually very deceptive, because it causes students to think that they're smarter and more, clever than they actually are. It's a counterfeit of the true art of reasoning, which begins with a mastery of classical grammar, so that we can learn to avoid ambiguity in language. So there's no shortcuts. You can't leapfrog grammar and think that you're going to get into reasoning and become Socrates. You can't leapfrog the study of language. You can't go into reasoning with a careless and sloppy use of terms, which is what we see many doing. Many who set themselves up as great debaters or teachers, what you'll find is they commit the faults warned of by Aristotle in the very first chapter in his work on reasoning. They're careless in their terms. They don't establish definitions, on and on. We can't pretend that there's a shortcut to true wisdom. Grammar is the first art of the trivium. Reasoning is the second art of the trivium. All classical philosophy is built on the trivium. There's no shortcut to true philosophy, no shortcut to true wisdom. And as I said, this one short chapter in Aristotle's work on the categories contains in it the entire art of grammar, without which we can't progress. And that's why, as I said at the beginning of this video, Aristotle's works are indeed published, but they're also not published. You can work through this and pretend you're studying Aristotle, but what you see is that Aristotle is telling us we must master grammar. And now the student has a choice to actually follow the instruction of Aristotle and master the art of grammar for the sake of the pursuit of wisdom, or pretend to have done so and just press on into the next lesson and be a faker, a pretender. The pretender won't go far in the study of Aristotle. The pretender will never enjoy the benefits that the teaching of Aristotle offers to us. You can fake it for a time, but it's going to catch up with you, and you're not going to have the benefits that are available through the study of the true art of classical reasoning and philosophy, which is built on reasoning. Reasoning is the instrument. You can read the works of Aristotelian philosophy, you can study ethics and physics and metaphysics, and you can read the words of Aristotle. You can memorize what Aristotle teaches. But the problem is that in your own life, in your own unique circumstances, when you face unique moral or physical or metaphysical problems and questions in your own life, in a future generation, you will not have the instrument to answer those questions and solve those problems. You'll know how Aristotle answered questions that existed in his day. You may read St. Thomas and learn how he answered questions using that instrument in his generation. But the questions in your generation, because you don't get the instrument, which Aristotle teaches us is the whole goal of education. If you don't get the instrument, you will never be able to answer the questions or solve the problems that you are actually responsible to solve in your own generation. That's the difference between a true student and a true philosopher and a pretender. The works of Aristotle are written to expose the pretenders. In this first chapter, we have a direction from Aristotle, the great philosopher, that directs us to the study of the art of grammar. We have to make sure we understand the parts of speech and their characteristics. We have to understand true syntax, the formation of sentences. We have to understand the relationship of words and their uses in senses, with different meanings in different contexts. We have to watch that we don't merely go on word hunts through texts, looking for the use of words to string together to make false arguments. This is what the sophists do, the deceivers. The sophists persuaded people through false arguments. And when Aristotle examined and investigated the arguments of the sophists to understand how they're deceiving people, this is lesson number 1, the ambiguity of terms, the deceitful and dishonest, inconsistent use of language. This is the beginning of the art of reasoning. If you're interested in reasoning truly, in testing arguments truly, in following true reasoning to its real conclusions, you have to learn the true art of reasoning. If you're simply interested in pushing your own opinions, in pursuing your own desires, and you're just looking for excuses and what are called apparent syllogisms or false arguments, you're just going to string words together, pull quotes from different books and sources because you're just looking for words to use as an excuse, then you don't need to study the art of reasoning. But it's that sophistry, that false and deceitful reasoning, that Aristotle's disciples learn to fight against and expose and overcome. So this is the challenge in the study of Aristotle. Just as he says in Ethics that a person who's not interested in being good has no part in the study of ethics, likewise, if you're not actually interested in subjecting yourself to truth, you have no real interest in classical reasoning. But if you do have a sincere desire to pursue wisdom and a sincere interest in the truth, this is the instrument. This is the way, the art of classical reasoning, and it begins here in this first chapter with carefulness and exactness in language. Every term has to be tested to see that when terms are used to refer to things, they are used synonymously. They don't merely have the same name, but behind the name, a different meaning. And they're also not mere relations to one another. They're not words that are similar. They're not different cases. They're not words derived from other words, but they're the same word with the same meaning. That's lesson 1 in Aristotle's classical reasoning in the first chapter of the categories. I hope that's a helpful introduction, not only to this first chapter, but to the study of Aristotle's art of reasoning in general, and also all of philosophy. As I said, though, this video is only intended to be an introduction. You have to do the work of studying on your own, and I hope that this video helps you to get started, helps you to see that in these short chapters, you're not to underestimate the difficulty of them by how long they are. They're short chapters, but as we'll see in chapter 2, they contain an incredible amount of information that needs to be unpacked through continued study, meditation, and experience. I hope this is a helpful introduction. Now it's time for you to study the lesson for mastery. God bless your studies.